Adrian never really had much connection to his family. In fact, that was the reason he joined the Soviet military shortly after he finished school. He felt that it was the only way he could escape expectations of his overbearing mother and father. After he left the military subsequent to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he found himself settled in the southern part of Estonia in a small, wood-log, cabin-esque house, as it was the only place he could afford. Due to the dismal state of the economy at the time, Adrian was hard-pressed to find work. The only job he managed to get was a temporary truck driving gig for a local moving company. He decided that he was desperate enough to look for income in ways that were less than legal. During his time in the military, he had a friend named Dimitry. After the both of them left the military, Dimitry thought that the surplus of weapons and munitions left about by the former Soviet Union would be easily acquired and sold to various, discerning customers around the globe, as he put it. Originally, the idea did not appeal to Adrian, as the last thing he wanted was to be sent to prison for weapons trafficking. But seeing as he had no options left, he decided that it was time to give good old Dimitry a call. He went to the closet to find his old duffel bag where he kept all his paperwork and other small items he had collected throughout his time of service. He found his old field book where he had written the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the few friends he had made. He found Dimitri's number and dialed it. Dimitry picked up. Adrian then explained that he was now interested in working in the illegal weapons trade with them. Dimitry instructed for Adrian to pack up and head to an address in the outskirts on Kiev. Adrian packed up a few suitcases worth of clothing and other possessions and loaded it all into his small yellow car that he had bought from an elderly lady a few months prior. He then began the long drive from Estonia to the Ukrainian capital. When he arrived at the address that Dimitry had given him, he looked and saw a small, one-story house sitting on a steep incline that looked like it was unoccupied. Not abandoned, just unoccupied. He walked up to the door and knocked. There was no response. He knocked again no response. After knocking and waiting for another 5 or so minutes, he decided that he would try and make his way into the house to investigate further, as he was confused to why Dimitry would send him to an empty house. He turned the doorknob and the door opened. He walked in and the house smelt distinctly of old motor oil. Seeing as the house was completely empty, save for a small box full of empty bottles a few feet away, the smell perplexed Adrian. He searched through the house, calling out to see if anyone was hiding in the residence somewhere, when he found a small closet with a red and brown rug on the floor. Adrian removed the rug and found that there was a hatch that could be opened. He did so and proceeded down the ladder that the hatch obscured. When he reached the bottom of the ladder, he looked around and saw crates of rifles and boxes overflowing with ammunition. He then looked over and saw his ever so enthusiastic friend Dimitry standing by an old surplus military cargo truck repainted to not seem like it was a military truck. Dimitry then explained that this location was perfect because it was hard to find and had easy street access, gesturing to the garage door that must lead out to the street adjacent to the one Adrian came in on. Dimitry asked Adrian, "What was the last gainful employment you have had, my friend?" "I worked a temporary job as a truck driver," he replied. "Then you should be aptly qualified for the job I have for you, friend," he said. He then explained, "All you will be doing is driving to collect the merchandise, or you shall be driving to deliver the merchandise." Simple, no. Adrian nodded his head. "When do I start?" Dimitry smiled at him. "Right now, my friend. I have been waiting for 2 days for you to arrive to drive this truck to the customers that have recently agreed to sell this load of high-quality weapons to." "Where am I to take the weapons?" said Adrian, looking at the back of the truck. "To a small warehouse 70 kilometers to the north," Dimitry said as he marked the location on a map that he then handed to Adrian. "Go, my friend. There is not much daylight left," shouted Dimitry as Adrian opened the door to the truck and climbed inside. Dimitry tossed him the keys and he started the old truck up. He waited until Dimitry had fully opened the garage door before proceeding to his marked destination. He arrived at the warehouse that evening to see 2 black cars and a white truck sitting idle as if expecting someone. He pulled up close to one of the cars and got out to walk over to the car to speak to the person inside. When he reached the first black car, he could not see inside because the windows were tinted too dark to see. The window rolled down and there was a bearded man wearing black aviators, which was odd because it was rather dark outside. The man spoke, "Are the packages ready for us to collect?" Adrian replied, "Yes, they should be. They are in the back of the truck." "Then I shall have me men remove them," the man said, then making a signal to the truck and the other car. His men unloaded the crates of weapons and subsequently placed them in their own truck. The man in the first car called for Adrian to come back over to him. He handed him an envelope, then rolled up the window and drove away. Adrian looked inside the envelope and counted 15,000 euros. Then he climbed back in the truck and returned to Dimity's garage. When he arrived, Dimitry was waiting expectantly. "Well?" he asked impatiently. "Here," mumbled Adrian as he tossed the envelope to Dimitry. Dimitry counted the money, then separated a smaller pile. He collected the bills from the smaller pile and handed them to Adrian. He looked at the bills and counted 5,000 euros. 5,000 for nothing more than a drive, he said, puzzled. Yes, my friend, as I have said, this business is very lucrative. I am glad you have decided to be a part of my operation, Dimitry said, satisfied with his friend's efforts. Where will I stay? Asked Adrian. It's not like you do not have money for a hotel, responded Dimitry playfully. Return tomorrow 500 hours, for we have much work to do. Why have all this money and live in such a cramped space? Asked Adrian. Dimitry did not reply. Instead, he pulled out a large sheet of paper, the likes of which looked like blueprints or schematics. Adrian studied them. They were the plans for active uranium munitions. Adrian looked at Dimitry in disbelief. Nuclear, he said, slowly. Yes, I have purchased these plans from a former Soviet scientist who worked on top-secret projects for many years. The plans are simple but require active uranium that has been chemically treated to be used, which is problematic because the substance is rather volatile and is impossible to transport without the proper containment apparatus. I have a supplier of the active uranium. However, I am not able to collect it because I lack the proper equipment to contain such a volatile substance. What is so special about the containers? Adrian asked. They are pressurized and use large electron magnets in conjunction with argon gas to maintain a force field around the inside layer of the canister that diffuses much of the radioactivity produced. Adrian looked at Dimitry, speechless. Dimitry then said, the only place that they are rumored to exist is in Chernobyl. So you want us to go trudging into a restricted radioactive city so that we can find magical cans that will allow us to make nuke bullets to sell to terrorists? Adrian spoke in an irritated tone. Well, when you put it like that, yes, Dimitry said. Adrian rolled his eyes and began to stand up from the couch when Dimitry stammered. We can make millions on these munitions. We can have everything we have ever wanted.
Adrian looked down at Dimitry. Dimitry spoke softly. Friend, you know this is the only way for us to be successful. Please help me.
What is the plan? How are we to get these canisters? Adrian responded. We are to fly in by helicopter. I have a contact. We land in Pripyat, then we make our way to the power plant to search for the containers. The radiation will certainly be high, interrupted Adrian. I have taken the liberty to acquire specially engineered radiation suits that we will pack and use when we arrive at the power plant. They will not fail us. Fine. When do we depart? Asked Adrian. Next Thursday, replied Dimitry. We will be meeting a friend, Peter. He will accompany us on the job. Adrian arrived at Dimitry's apartment to begin what was sure to be a long, stressful, and foolish adventure venturing into the radioactive dead city of Chernobyl. He opened the front door and saw Dimitry pulling out a large wooden crate from a closet in the hall adjacent to the living room. Dimitry then grabbed a crowbar from the floor next to him and began to pry open the crate. After a few minutes of Dimitry's forceful and sweaty pries at the lid of the wooden crate, it finally gave. Inside were what looked like 3 green hazmat suits, only not so baggy and more form-fitting. Dimitry grabbed one and tossed it to Adrian. Here, put this with your equipment, he said. These are the suits meant to protect us from the radiation. Adrian said. Dimitry responded, yes, they should prevent us from contracting radiation sickness for a time. How long? Adrian asked as he folded the suit up and placed it in his backpack. Long enough, Dimitry muttered. Adrian moved to the table in the living room. On it were several rifles and sidearms set about. No doubt ones that had been scavenged from an abandoned Soviet military facility. The very same weapons that they had been trafficking around Europe for the last 6 months. Adrian put on his tactical vest. He attached the straps to the pouches on his legs. He put on knee pads and elbow pads. He made adjustments to make sure that the rig fit comfortably on his torso. Adrian picked up the weapon that appealed to him, a 6 Sauer 556 with an aimpoint red dot sight and a forward foregrip. He also grabbed the HK sidearm and checked the mag. Then he put his pistol in the holster on his right leg pouch. He then put 2 spare mags for the pistol on the spots next to the holster. He grabbed 4 mags for the 6 Sauer and placed them in his vest. He also grabbed a few flares and a spare flashlight and tucked them into a convenient spot on his rig in such a way that they would not impede his movements. When he was satisfied with his equipment, he looked over at Dimitry, who had put his rig on and was waiting for Adrian to finish. He then shouted, "Let's go. We must make our way to the airfield. Peter is waiting for us." They then got in Dimitry's silver Saab and drove to an airfield a few dozen kilometers west of Kiev. They drove to one of the hangars to see a man leaning against a Soviet helicopter, although any markings of the USSR had been painted over upon its acquisition. The two men got out of the car and walked over to the man leaning against the helicopter. "Are we ready?" asked Dimitry in an impatient but excited tone. "Yes, the weather looks good, and we have the necessary fuel to make the journey," the man replied. Peter, you never disappoint me," Dimitry replied. Adrian followed Dimitry into the seats in the rear of the helicopter as Peter climbed into the cockpit and began flipping switches and such as he started up the helicopter. "Off we go," Dimitry said as he looked at Adrian as they ascended into the overcast Ukrainian sky. Adrian looked out over the landscape as they flew towards their destination. About an hour later, they could see the sprawling expanse of the abandoned city of Pripyat, once home to over 50,000 people, now desolate, empty, and dead. They landed on a clearing in the city next to a few tall apartment buildings. Adrian followed Dimitry out of the helicopter, feeling the water being pushed out of the moss underneath his boot as his foot touched the ground for the first time. Peter waved as he took off and flew away to the south. "He will be here again in 8 hours to collect us," Dimitry said. "Why must we be dropped off here and not closer to the power plant?" responded Adrian. "Because there's radar near the plant, not in the city however. They do not monitor Pripyat as closely as the power plant," Dimitry explained. "We must find the road that leads toward Chernobyl. I think it is this way," Dimitry said as he motioned for the two of them to begin walking towards another group of dilapidated apartment buildings that once were the homes of many of the plant workers and their families over a few years ago. They walked past the apartment buildings and entered a large concrete clearing. Although the concrete was cracked and weeds and other plant life had sprung up through the cracks, they proceeded until Dimitry put up his hand motioning for them to halt. The two heard growling from around the corner as well as several sets of footsteps that sounded as if they were getting closer. A few seconds later, after the growls grew much louder, a pack of at least a half dozen gigantic wolves rounded the corner and charged at our position. They looked like they weighed at least 300 pounds, with huge, jagged, blood-covered teeth and large, piercing red eyes that seemed to ravage your very soul exponentially for every second you gazed into them. They both began to fire at them as they charged. The bullets seemed to not affect them even in the slightest way, except for one of the wolves that fell to the ground and began to bleed on the cracked concrete. Dimitry was ahead of him, so he was the one to be attacked by the wolves first. They bit into his arms and legs, and they sunk their teeth into his abdomen as they growled and snarled. Adrian emptied his magazine, knowing that bullets would not be fast enough to save his friend. He pulled one of the flares from his vest and lit it as he screamed and shouted at the massive wolves. They then ran off frightened by the bright red light. Adrian quickly knelt down to tend to his wounded comrade. He had several bite marks and a few other minor flesh wounds, but none of them seemed that they were going to be fatal. "There is an old hospital a short ways to the west of here. Go there and find some fucking bandages," Dimitry said as he propped himself against a trash can next to a bench in the clearing. Adrian ran to the west, past the apartment buildings he had previously went between. He ran by what looked to be an old church, with vegetation growing in through the broken windows. When he saw the hospital, he sprinted towards the door and tried to open it. It was a thick glass double door but has been locked with a thick, rusty chain and padlock. Not having bolt cutters or any other way to cut the lock, Adrian decided to pull out his sidearm and shoot the large door, hoping the bullets wouldn't ricochet and hit him in the face. To his relief, the door shattered and he was able to walk inside. He looked around to find a sign that would lead him to the in hopes to find some bandages and other medical supplies. He then found the dusty sign he was looking for and then followed it to the His eyes scanned the room until he found a large, wheeled cart with packages of bandages on it. He quickly grabbed a few of them and raced back towards the entrance of the hospital, where he was momentarily stunned by sunlight in the large, well-illuminated atrium of the hospital. He then walked outside of the hospital and raced back towards the clearing where he had left Dimitry. When he rounded the corner and could see where Dimitry had been, he stopped, motionless. Dimitry was not there. Adrian looked around the clearing, with no sign of Dimitry. He approached the trash can Dimitry had originally been leaned against. He called out for his friend, but there was no response. All that he could see was a short trail of blood that abruptly ended at the entrance of one of the adjacent apartment buildings. Adrian entered the building, continuing to call out for Dimitry in the hopes that he would answer back and that he could tend to his wounds and continue their journey. Upon his progression into the dark building, he smelled a putrid, horrific odor emanating from the depths of the hallway ahead of him. As he walked further, the hallway became so odoriferous that Adrian began to heave as his gag reflex took effect. He strained, hoping that he would at least vomit, ending the convulsions, but nothing would exit his body. The smell was too much for Adrian to handle, too much for any person to withstand. The smell of rotted flesh, decaying and fermented bile, and the striking stench of large quantities of blood would make any human attempt to flee as soon as they encountered the scent. Adrian began making his way back towards the entrance of the building when he heard a loud sound which could only be described as a loud slurping and gurgling sound. When he heard this, he began sprinting towards the light at the entrance. He looked back after he had cleared the building. He was terrified, confused, and wondered where his friend Dimitry was. He then assumed that Dimitry would make his way to safety and that they would rendezvous later at the helicopter. Knowing Dimitry would be very disappointed if the mission was a failure, Adrian decided that he would continue on to try and locate the canisters at the power plant. He began to walk the empty streets of Pripyat, searching for the long road that led to Chernobyl. After about an hour for searching, he found what he decided was the road that would take him to his destination. As he walked the road, he could not help but think about the sounds and smells that he had encountered earlier. He feared for his friend. Eventually, he convinced himself that there must have just been a dead animal in the building and that the sounds were just tricks his mind were playing on itself. He walked on. It was Thursday, and on Thursday the workers tending to the destroyed power plant all took a day off from working in the hazardous irradiated ruins of the old power plant, thus making it possible for Adrian to slip into the place without being noticed and arrested. Eventually he came to see a gated checkpoint, where usually there would be guards stationed there to make sure no one entered the premises without permission. But there were none. There was no sign of anyone. Adrian made his way past the checkpoint and proceeded further along the road. He then saw it, the ruins of the Chernobyl power plant, with its sarcophagus encasing the area where reactor 4 was. He walked closer as he then checked his radiation detector. The readings were high, but not to a point that would cause concern for his immediate safety. He slowly progressed towards the power plant, eyes scanning the area for a way inside of the building. Eventually, he found a large, metal, double door that looked like it led where he needed to go. He tried opening it but found that it had obviously been locked. He stepped back, searching for another way inside when he noticed the windows above him to the right. They were about 5 feet above him, and some of them were open. If he could find a way to raise himself, then he would be able to enter the facility. He then found a few stacks of wooden crates that he could stack together to get himself to the windows. He grabbed the first one and placed it on the ground next to the building. Then he lugged the second one and placed it on top of the first one. As he grabbed the third crate, he heard a subtle gurgle, much the same as the one he had heard before in that terrifying apartment building. He then shook his head and put it on the ground, using it to step up and climb his way into the building. As he tried to fit through the window after he had dropped his bag through before him, he struggled to fit through the thin window. Finally, after trying to shove himself through for a few minutes, he finally fell through the gap of the window, and with a loud thud, he hit the ground. Assessing himself to see if there was any indication of injury, he got up and looked around the dark room illuminated only by the sunlight shining through the open windows. After he had deduced that he was not hurt, he turned on the flashlight on his rifle and shone it around, trying to get his bearings. He found himself in what appeared to be the entrance of the building. He looked for a sign to help him navigate his dark and dusty surroundings. He found a sign with 2 control on it. He assumed that this would lead to the control room of Reactor 2. He walked down the dusty hallway that the sign pointed to. It was very dark, but from the light shining from his rifle's flashlight, he could see that the walls, floor, and ceiling were white. There were various pipes running along the wall. Adrian eventually got to the doorway to the Reactor 2 control room. He walked inside and gazed at the large control console before him. Countless gauges, buttons, and switches lay idle and unused. He peered through the window into Reactor's main hall. The way, for the most part, was empty. He had taken a mental picture of the diagram that Dimitry had set before him back at his apartment. He was looking for a container the size of a small keg. He scanned the reactor's main hall for anything remotely close to what he was looking for. He found nothing but an empty nuclear reactor. As he turned and headed for the door, he looked at a stray clipboard on the control console. He approached and picked it up. As he studied it, he realized that it was the shipping manifest for the canisters, as well as other items listed only by odd acronyms and obscure code names. He read on the manifest that the items were to be hand-delivered to the main reactor hall of Reactor 4. After he read this, his heart sank into his stomach. He knew that Reactor 4 was the one that exploded, causing the disaster. He knew that it was full of insanely high radiation levels, and he knew that he must enter and risk his life to achieve his mission. He sighed as he closed the door behind him, hanging his head down, praying that he would be able to quickly find what he needed and be able to leave this hellish place once and for all. He set down his backpack and unzipped it. He grabbed and unfolded that special green radiation suit that he had been given. He took off his boots and pants, then his shirt and vest, then he slipped on the suit. It was very form-fitting, so he was able to put his vest, pants, and boots back on. He grabbed the head mask that went with the suit. It looked similar to a regular gas mask, except that it was connected to a tank filled with a mix of oxygen and nitrogen, similar to the air found in the Earth's atmosphere. Also different was that the eye lenses were a bright saturated green that almost seemed to glow. He put it on and checked to see if the mask's breather was feeding from the tank. After he found that it was, he made his way to the door of Reactor 4's main hallway. Poe noticed that the door had a large padlock on it. Adrian stepped back and took a deep breath. He fired a round through the top of the lock connecting it to the door. He recalled from the manifest that the canisters were meant to be in the small room on the right side of the reactor hall, and from his familiarity of these reactors he gained from looking down into Reactor 2, Adrian deduced that the room must be directly to his right and about 25 feet away. He didn't know, however, if he was going to be able to gain access to the room. Who knows, maybe it was under 3,000 pounds of highly irradiated rubble and impossible to access. Nevertheless, he kicked the door open and quickly took a step inside. He felt a warm, tingling sensation all over his body as he looked around at the dark, dusty ruins before him. He quickly began to walk down a pile of rubble that led to the right. As he was walking, he tripped and began to slide down the rubble. He tumbled and rolled over, slamming into the rubble until he hit the wall he was headed towards. He realized, after he collected himself, that this was the door he was looking for. He opened it, and the room must have been under a greatly different pressure than the one he was in, because it was as if the door was holding back a gale force wind, one that slapped Adrian in that face like a woman who had just been greatly offended. He looked and found 2 metal cylinders. They were about 3 feet long and about 1 foot thick. They had a set of handles on the top and bore the usual yellow radiation warnings on its side. Near the handles at the top, however, was a small display and a few buttons next to it. These must have been the controls for the canister's special pressure systems. Using a bungee cord, he attached the 2 canisters to his backpack. They must have been empty because they did not weigh that much. He exited the room and climbed his way out from the rubble and out of the reactor hall back into the hallway he entered from. Dusting himself off, he closed the door behind him and took the mask off. He was sweaty around the areas where the mask touched his skin. He wiped his face and pointed his flashlight around to try and find the hallway to the entrance of the building. He did, and walked his way to where he had fallen into from the windows. Being inside the building this time, he could just unlock the large door and walk right out. He quickly jogged his way across the complex and down the road he came from. He passed the empty checkpoint and looked back at the power plant one last time before continuing down the road leading back to Pripyat. As he arrived back at the clearing between buildings where Dimitry was attacked, Adrian could see that the blood trail leading into the apartment building was brown and oxidized. This is when he realized that this whole mission would be for naught unless he could find Dimitry. He put the mask back on and reluctantly made his way back into the dark apartment building once more in search of his friend. Even though he now wore a breathing mask, he was still met with that horrid, putrid smell, but with the mask, it was now just only bearable. He walked down the hallway, following the trail of blood as it began to grow darker. The trail turned a corner and led up a flight of stairs. At this point, Adrian was beginning to have serious doubts about that status of Dimitry. He reached the top of the stairs and followed down the hallway it led to until he reached a closed door with blood on the handle. That horrid odor was at its strongest, and he could hear that slurping and bubbling sound again. He began to sweat as he gripped the handle, terrified of what lay within. He opened the door. What awaited him inside was dissimilar to any earthly entity Adrian had ever witnessed. It looked to be a large, fleshy, gelatinous creature that looked to be made of dead flesh being stretched and torn, with sacks full of a dark, bloody substance. As Adrian looked at the center of the creature, he could see the face of his friend, stretched and torn, eyes replaced with 2 small sacks of chunky blood, bones protruding from various locations, and its mouth was convulsing, appearing to be attempting to suck all of the air out of the room, causing the loud, slurping noise. The creature had appeared to be growing with every second that Adrian gazed at it. It grew on and into the old walls, up onto the ceiling and along the floor. Adrian screamed and fell backwards, knocking loose the 2 canisters that he had clipped to his backpack. He saw on one of them that it had a "do not put in water" warning on it and a small picture of an explosive warning. Adrian knew what he must do. He rolled each of the canisters towards the creature until the canister came in contact with it. Ever so slowly the creature began to cover it with a dark, bloody substance as it began to envelop the canisters. Adrian stood up and said, "I am sorry, Dimitry, forgive me." He ran out of the building as quickly as he could. He could hear the helicopter coming in to collect him. As he reached it and boarded it, Peter, sitting in the cockpit, asked where Dimitry was, and Adrian responded only with, "He has left this world. What he has become must be eradicated, for the good of all mankind, and all of this earth." Peter asked and pried more, but eventually took off and began to fly back to Kiev. About 3 minutes after they had taken off, Adrian and Peter could see a large concussive explosion from an apartment building. Peter yelled at Adrian, asking what happened, but Adrian would say nothing. When they arrived back at the airfield in Kiev, Adrian quickly stepped off the helicopter and began to walk away before Peter could offer him a ride. Adrian walked through the door of his home in Estonia and sat down on his couch and turned on the television. He was in a live news broadcast with a shot of Pripyat, with a headline, "Explosion in Pripyat, Arms Trafficker Suspected." The news reported that a man suspected in an illegal arms trafficking investigation is currently missing and suspected to be in connection with the explosion. Adrian turned off the television and bowed his head. As the next few days went on, Adrian had vivid nightmares each night. He could see the monster that Dimitry had become. The thing he had seen haunted him. He could never make it go away. He could never forget what he had seen. One day he tried to rationalize the events. He thought that the bites from the wolves carried some sort of disease and that the exposure to the radiation in the area caused it to grow explosively. But he could never be sure, nor did he care to be. The important thing to him was that this was all done with. Adrian just wanted to live his life without the constant memories of the unfathomable horrors of that place. Years passed. Adrian lay in a hospital bed suffering from a severed thyroid cancer that he was receiving treatment for. He generally passed the time by reading a book that a nurse would occasionally bring to him. But he had finished all the books he had, and the nurse had not been by to replenish his supply of reading material. So he decided to turn on the TV. He flipped through the channels. He could not find anything that interested him, so he decided just to set it to the news channel. When he did so, he saw a news story about the increase of wolf population in the area surrounding Chernobyl. He sat there, motionless. The reality of what he saw slowly began to consume his mind. He began to scream and thrash about in his hospital bed. Nurses and doctors came in to see what was all the fuss. Adrian continued to thrash as the hospital staff put him in restraints. He was taken to the psych ward to be evaluated. His cancer being so severe and his violent and erratic state made it impossible for Adrian to continue his treatment. He would die within days. 4 days later, the nurse came in to check on Adrian but found him motionless and cold. He called a doctor in to go about the necessary procedures for dealing with a hospital death. When the nurses stepped out of the room, one of them received a phone call. It was her 23-year-old daughter saying she had been bit by a large wolf when her and her friend had stopped on the side of the road to take a picture of the fence that indicated the Chernobyl exclusion zone. The nurse asked her if she was okay and if she would be able to make it home. After her daughter reassured her, she hung up the phone and continued about her day. There have been an ever-increasing population of wolves in the Ukraine, and reports have been made of wolf population increases in the countries adjacent to it. These wolves are known to be hostile towards humans and will not hesitate to attack on sight. Experts estimate that by 2020, the wolf population will grow to over 50 million and will have spread to northern Europe and as far south as Greece. No solutions have been suggested as to how to slow the wolves' rapid population growth.